Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to today's American Nuclear Society online panel reflections on COP28. I'm Craig Piercy, the CEO of ANS, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this discussion. Today's program is being sponsored by the ANS Trustees of Nuclear, our premier utility and supplier membership program. Funding from the Trustees of Nuclear supports our campaigns to improve nuclear literacy in K-12 classrooms, our larger public discourse, and the technical substance of our policy conversations in Washington and around the country. To learn more, visit ans.org/trustees. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a couple of quick notes regarding today's events. So today is more of a fireside chat. We're going to take a few audience questions toward the end. Use the Q&A function to put your question in the chat. The event will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to event registrants tomorrow. Additionally, certificates of attendance for the event are available by request. Please see the chat for contact information. And finally, we ask that all participants adhere to the ANS Code of Ethics and Respectful Behavior Policy, which can be found at ans.org. So with those notes out of the way, let's introduce today's panelists. Go ahead and turn your cameras on. So when it comes to the art of the nuclear deal, she is our Georgia O'Keeffe, Pillsbury's global energy industry leader, Elina Teplinsky. He gets the invites to all the best COP parties, Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath, Jeremy Harrell, and last but not least, our resident COP whisperer, President and CEO of Lightbridge Corporation, Seth Grae. Okay, so welcome everybody. Let's set the scene here. All of us were at COP28 2 months ago, and what a thing it was, right? I mean, 100,000 people, twice as many as any other COP before, in the middle of the desert, long lines, multiple events. No one person seemed to have a complete picture of the schedule, the green zone, the blue zone. It's so hard, even when you're there, to understand what's going on, let alone if you're watching it from a distance. Seth, how do people that weren't at COP, how do you mentally construct a model to understand how COP works?
Well, this was the largest COP ever on a physically huge site that had been the site for Dubai Expo, the World's Fair that was held in 2021 and 22. It could take an hour to walk from one side of the site all the way across to the other, with hundreds of small to medium-sized buildings with different things going on in them, and a main exhibition center with the main negotiations among the countries going on there. This COP had the most countries ever represented at COP, the most attendees, and the most different buildings with these pavilions and booths and panels and different things going on in them. What it was all leading up to was a negotiated final statement that everyone was trying to influence. And as you walked around going to where you were scheduled to get to, you could run into a US congressional delegation, a government official, someone else, and try to grab them and influence them while you got them, and talk to a lot of media. And to me, one of the interesting things was just how that final statement was really negotiated there. A lot of governments tried to influence it beforehand, but it really wasn't in the bag. So for example, for nuclear, whether nuclear would be specifically mentioned as a way to combat climate change was something determined, as COP was winding up. And there was a lot of suspense. There was a lot of drama being there of how's all this going to come together, a lot of kind of behind the scenes whispering of this country wants that, they'll trade this, they'll trade that, and a lot of drama, a lot of intrigue, but also just hundreds of different panels, events, lunches, different things you could go into. Officially in the blue zone area where the negotiations happened, in the green zone that this COP was very large with all kinds of activities, including for nuclear energy, and off-site at major events, at hotels, at different things with lunches and nuclear events. You could have been very busy and never even gone on to the COP site that had 100,000 people on it.
Yeah, yeah. Elina, you've been to a few of these. Like, how do you describe it to people that have never been? Like, how do you give them actually a feel for what it's like to be on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. So for next COP, if you know how to rollerblade, bring rollerblades. Because I kept thinking I've got to figure out some way to get from point A to point B faster than it's taking me on foot. And there were some buggies and bikes that I could take, but those took a while as well. But the reason I mentioned that is because you did want to get from point A to point B in a matter of minutes, because there was so many interesting sessions going on and so many interesting meetings that you wanted to be part of. So nuclear in some ways was confined, as far as the nuclear specific areas were confined, to a couple of places, one in the blue zone and one in the green zone. But there was so many other discussions that were taking place on deep decarbonization, on industrial decarbonization, kind of across the energy transition, which nuclear was absolutely part of. And when I would go to those sessions and I would mention nuclear to people, they would be absolutely interested, on board, wanting to learn more. So I think a lot of us who were there were trying to actually participate in the non-nuclear sessions as well and be part of those discussions. But it was super challenging because all of this was happening at the same time, and so many different events, so many different players. And I think what really struck me this year, COP is a real hodgepodge. I think it's really unique. As Seth mentioned, they are, presidents there, members of parliament and Congress. At the same time, you've got environmental activists, indigenous groups, industry. But the number of CEOs that I saw at this COP, I think, was pretty unprecedented. And some of them were CEOs not exactly from the most popular companies when it comes to climate change mitigation. So you had, oil and gas companies, their CEOs showed up, and some of them got chewed out by the ministers who were there, and they were there. And, I think they understood the importance of being there as part of their company's commitment to decarbonization, and, making that commitment a little more forceful by being in a place that wasn't necessarily very friendly to them at all times. But also from the nuclear industry, you saw all of the companies, the large ones, the small ones, and the innovative side, that understood the importance of also participating in these discussions and getting nuclear to people who normally do not interface with nuclear.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jeremy, give me your take. Well, what was it like to be on the ground there, and give people a feel for what it's like.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I think Elina makes a really important point here. This was my third COP, just for perspective, and that influx of private sector individuals, executives on the ground, I think is the biggest change that I've seen, and I think it's a change that's here to stay. COP is rapidly moving away from what it was 25 years ago, that was simply the government ministers coming into what is like a small trade center and having negotiations on the side and booths and doing bilateral, multilateral agreements, to truly a big international convening that the negotiations, the official government stuff, is just one piece of the puzzle. I think COP is going to become more like the Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show type thing for climate. And I mean that in a good way, actually. I think this is a positive development. I think as we think about climate action and clean energy, it's a lot more about negotiating X word or Y word in some joint communique between hundreds of countries. It's now starting to become the impetus for companies to announce billion-dollar investments, for countries to announce both bilateral and multilateral partnerships, and for folks to showcase what they're doing. Our friends at GE Hitachi or GE as a whole, GE Verona now, I guess, had both a VR system, so you could look at their small modular reactor and look into their gas turbines, and a big exhibit with a huge wind turbine, right? As we were going through, like, a lot of those type of things were happening. Circular economy, transportation. You could start going and seeing autonomous cars. So it ended up being a lot more like CES, if anyone's been to that, which, you hop around Vegas and you get to see all the cool tech that's coming out. And then layered on top of it is this like kind of significant diplomatic proceedings that are happening and ultimately driving some of these actions as well. So it was probably more fun than I think previous times have been, and I hope that it's a change that remains, because I think the confluence of public and private sector action towards climate and clean energy is really important, and I think it's a good forcing mechanism to drive results.
Yeah, just to kind of build off of that. So, first of all, just for everyone, just to set the scene a little bit, this convention center was not really near the city, the downtown of Dubai at all. It was about 30 minutes away. You could take the train, but from downtown, it was probably going to take you more than an hour. So really, rideshare was the way to go, Uber, but you could never set the actual location where to drop you off, because the roads would always be closed. And so it would drop you off. If it dropped you off on the other side, you were looking at a 45-minute walk. But then you would get there and you'd be in these sort of long winding lines, right? Trying to get in or to get your credentials. And you'd be in this line, and you sort of pass the same people like 20 times, right? So you sort of get like little snippets of their conversation. You kind of almost got to know them that way. And Lisa Marshall, our incoming president, where she and I were in line at like the second or third day, and we heard somebody in the line next to us talking about the green zone and the blue zone, and we walked by, and I hear him say, "Yeah, the green zone's for chumps, right? That the blue zone is where you want to be." But actually, in this COP, the blue zone was sort of much more smaller scale, much more crowded, kind of the buildings were half finished. And then you walked out to the green zone, and they had these really large pavilions with demonstrations. So that seems to certainly have changed from previous COPs. But I kind of want to get into the significance of this COP, right? That again, we had that announcement, 24 nations committing to a tripling of nuclear energy by 2050. That was, really not formally part of the COP, but it definitely seemed to drive some of the discussion. And I also get the sense, and Jeremy, back to your point, that there is, there's more commercial interest now. And when there's commercial involvement there, you tend to get into more practical questions of how do you, even how you decarbonize your, fossil fuel delivery systems and that sort of thing. So, Elina, I want to go to you first, because you kind of, as an attorney, you help people make deals and help nuclear people make nuclear deals. How much of a change did you feel that, did you see there in that meeting for that? And how much of what happened at COP really, did it put nuclear on the map? And how is it different from previous COPs?
Absolutely. So I think just to set the stage, it helps to understand what the COP is, because I found increasingly everyone now knows about the COP. Nobody used to, if you were not in the energy industry, you wouldn't know about the COP. But, my neighbors were like, "Oh, Dubai, you went to Dubai, you went to the COP." But what is the COP, right? The COP is the conference of the parties. Who are the parties? These are the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a convention that has 198 members. And you wonder, how do you get 198 members when there's only like 191 countries? Actually, the EU is a member. You've got some observer states like Palestine, that are members. So you've got more parties to that convention than there are countries in the world, which tells you how difficult it is to negotiate anything, right? When you've got 198 members. And what happened at this COP, Seth mentioned that agreement at the end. What that agreement was is something called the Global Stocktake. And that goes to the Paris Agreement, which is kind of a convention that accompanies the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there was the first agreement 5 years after the Paris Convention was signed that basically takes stock of where we are as far as measures that we're going to take, as the world to decarbonize, to mitigate climate change. In addition to that, you also have these nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and that is each country's legal obligation under the convention to actually mitigate climate change. So we haven't had those yet. That's going to be in Rio in 2030. But this global stocktake is basically something that had to be agreed to by the 198 members as the outcome of this COP, as kind of a measure of where we are and also what we need to do so that when we get to 2030, those NDCs are actually achieving something, instead of just being kind of pronouncements, right? So the importance of this COP for the nuclear industry, of course, Craig, you mentioned that announcement at the very beginning, certainly having all of these nations get together, more than 20 countries, the presidents get together with industry, by the way. You mentioned the industry role, right? WNA was very instrumental in facilitating all of that. So industry was right there hand in hand with government. So that was an important political pronouncement. That pronouncement could have been made anywhere, right? This was just, a good place to make it. It gave good visibility for nuclear energy. But the global stocktake, that agreement at the end that Seth was talking about, that's the really key part, because nuclear has never been mentioned in any of these agreements that come out of the COP. And of course, some of it is that, there's anti-nuclear bias, right? There's not a lot of understanding about the nuclear energy contribution to climate change mitigation. And you have countries that, of course, are anti-nuclear, but also, it's very different for nuclear than it is for renewables, in that any country can build a renewable facility without having a renewable program. Versus for nuclear, you have to have a nuclear program, right, in order to build even one nuclear power plant. So the number of countries that have nuclear or want nuclear are much more limited than the 198 countries. And here you have this global stocktake, and it actually listed nuclear as one of the pathways that the member states to UNFCCC will take to decarbonize. So that's a big achievement. It's not as big as what was mentioned about renewables, which is, that we will triple renewables. But once again, it would be strange to see a tripling of nuclear in a document that had to be agreed to by 198 parties for the reasons that I mentioned. So the fact that nuclear was even included in the pathway, to me, is a pretty significant achievement.
Yeah. Yeah. So Seth, I want to pick up on what Elina was talking about here, because the ANS is technically an observer to the UN, right? So we had blue zone credentials. I see a question in the chat, the difference between the green zone and the blue zone. The blue zone was for people that were credentialed as either party delegations of nations or observer organizations. Seth, you were kind of our veteran hand here. We sent a group of 12 people to COP, and ran that through a competitive process. But we focused on having young people participate as part of Nuclear for Climate, which is sort of this larger international organization that brings in young nuclear technical experts that come to COP to be able to talk about nuclear. How do you think the impact of our young members, both ANS and Nuclear for Climate, how would you describe that impact, and then maybe just opine on again the sort of the significance of this COP?
Yeah, these successes wouldn't have happened without them, and what they've done at previous COPs leading up to this. I think what happened at COP in favor of nuclear is reflective of what was happening in the world leading up to COP. Putin decided to invade Ukraine and got a lot of European countries really interested in how do we get off relying on his fossil fuels, and others very interested for national security reasons and how to move off fossil fuels, and nuclear being part of that. Germany and others demonstrating you really can't get there from here on meeting climate goals, on shutting down nuclear reactors and just adding fossil fuels. And there were these young nuclear experts in Nuclear for Climate in particular, very active around the world, going to places on Stand Up for Nuclear events and other nuclear events, talking to politicians, talking to influential people who would go to COP. And then at COP, were wearing their blue shirts. It was almost like a sports team in uniform, deployed there, doing their job. And unlike previous COPs where they tended to sort of be catch as catch can, try to ask a nuclear question in a non-nuclear event, see if you can meet a government official here and there, they were very strategic on which country needed this support, from whom, go talk to them. And it was very well organized, very strategic, very effective. And I really think all these great nuclear results at COP was really partly because of these very young, very motivated, very effective nuclear supporters.
So Jeremy, this is, I mean, maybe you can call this the pragmatic COP, right? Where people and countries and delegations, as you're taking stock of where we are, and obviously if you're you're concerned about 1.5C, let's recognize that we're gonna overshoot and have to correct. And so, again, it seems like from that perspective, there might have been a shift in emphasis. You've been to 3. I mean, have you seen that? And then, what else do you want to say about the significance of this COP particularly?
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. And Seth really underscores the right point. I think the geopolitical situation is a big driver of that. And to Elina's point, like, we are rapidly marching on the time where countries are going to have to update their commitments. Brazil in 2 years, and the global stock take was sobering this year, right? More or less, everyone's going to come back in 2 years and realize that more or less no one's done what is needed to be on track for 1.5 in particular, but even some modest upticks there. And when we talk about 0.5 degree, that's a significant change, right? It doesn't seem like much on its surface, but is really a significant shift. And so I do think it's led to some practical realism. I think it also has shown it was indicative of the significant momentum this industry has, and private sector developers and technologies and the supply chain have, and the potential that it can bring. I think folks recognize the need for nuclear, not only to decarbonize power, but also for heat applications as well. That's one area where I was fascinated by a big shift. I think here in the US and among this community as a whole, we've been talking a lot more about non-traditional customers, non-traditional applications. We saw a lot more of that in Dubai, and I think the host helps with that some, right? Like they're thinking about this from a desalination standpoint, from processed heat, but ultimately, I think it's a global recognition that we need more solutions to decarbonizing heavy industry. Our good friends at X Energy here in the US and Dow are trying to pilot a little bit of that here with the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. But I think it's a practicality, and it's a true recognition of the diversity of solution that nuclear can provide based on the technologies that are racing to the marketplace.
So let me ask the 3 of you a question. If anybody, I don't have this for any particular person, but Seth, in our previous conversations, and I think you noted it today, right? Like this is in many ways like a football game where in a sense you don't quite know how it's going to go until it starts, right? Because plays happen, and the game is influenced throughout the course of the game by what happens in the game, which changes everyone's strategy. I would probably say most notably, I believe it was Mohammed Al-Jabbar, the head of, there was a discussion about whether there is a phase down or a phase out of fossil fuels, right? And that sort of, there was a suggestion by the chair that there be a phase down, which then sort of energized the environmental community and really kind of shaped the debate for a couple of days. Do you see, and I'll ask, anybody, I'll take volunteers here, but did that have any impact over the decision to, in the final stock take, name check some of the various clean energy sources? Was it separate or was it related?
Well, first of all, I think everything is related because it is a negotiation, and the negotiators from the countries are linking these things and trying to influence what the group will agree with. And the language ended up not being phase down, phase out, but more along the lines of transition away from fossil fuels in an undefined way. But during that process, in front of a hot microphone and a camera, there was a comment along the lines of the science not showing that we need to move completely away from fossil fuels to meet climate goals. And I think that created such an uproar, and so much of the energy of the negotiators steered into that language of transition away from fossil fuels, that at least to me, in my interactions in there, it was easier to promote getting nuclear in there than it otherwise would have been. But for that brouhaha, it created a little more of an opening. But I think the announcement that already had relating to the tripling of nuclear power goal by so many countries, an announcement of tripling renewables, but including nuclear within that announcement, I think helped. And we all noticed that hydroelectric, which is the largest source of non-emitting power in the world, was not included in the final statement, where nuclear was. And I think that's partly because of nuclear, including these young activists, were so much pushing, the delegations to include nuclear, and hydro just didn't have that kind of an organized effort.
Mm-hmm. Elina, Jeremy, any other word on that?
One thing that I would add is, leading up to the COP, there was a lot of conversations, and actually, Special Envoy for Climate John Kerry was starting to push this, was conversation on unabated fossil fuels, right? And so, I think many of us in the energy sector, carbon capture technologies, for example, can be a solution both for power emissions on fossil generating power plants, as well as a key tool in industrial decarbonization. ClearPath's view, we need all of these things, but the debate in COP was starting to talk about quite a few of those things. And then to Seth's point, when the shift became on phasing your transitioning away from fossils as well, you're immediately taking a bunch of solution sets off the table. And so I agree with them. I think it really built the case that, given all the momentum that was happening at COP on the sidelines around nuclear and the practical reality of the different solution sets that can contribute to industrial sector and power sector decarbonization, it was a no-brainer for them to include nuclear, to frankly have the statement taken seriously. And so I think it was a critical piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and Elina, hydrogen fits into this too, right? Because obviously, many different production methods for hydrogen, and just a lot of talk about, rather than just getting rid of things, right, or saying this is what we're not going to do, how do we decarbonize? How do we decarbonize sectors? How do we go within those sectors and really, methodically, granularly lower the carbon footprint? Is that conversation on the rise now? Did you see things at this COP that said, yeah, we're moving forward on that in a way that we haven't before?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see with each COP an increasing focus on the hard to abate sectors. So much of the focus initially was just on that electrifying, what you can electrify, and then decarbonizing the power sector, which is certainly responsible for a significant amount of emissions, about 25% worldwide. But then there's the rest, right? The 75 and things that you can't electrify. And that's where really nuclear has a very unique role to play, because in order to create a large scale hydrogen market, for example, and hydrogen is kind of viewed as a silver knife of deep decarbonization, where it can decarbonize transportation, it can decarbonize industry, it can decarbonize heating and cooling. As we're sitting in, the very hot Middle East that requires air conditioning for everything, even in the middle of the winter, in the middle of December, you kind of realize the impact, right? If we didn't have this AC here, we would all be really suffering, and we need energy for that AC, right? And that's a lot of carbon emissions. But nuclear has a very unique role to play because of all, of course, the attributes of nuclear, being carbon free and 24/7, but also because nuclear can produce heat in addition to electricity, which can be used for these processes, right? For the hydrogen production, it can be used for desalination. Once again, very important, sitting in the Middle East. A lot of the countries in the Gulf are looking to nuclear as a way to ensure that they can effectively desalinize water. All sorts of industrial processes, all of that I think is increasingly taking center stage at COP. And that was a lot of the discussions that I was having outside of kind of the nuclear booths about, how nuclear can contribute. And I think that was very well received, for sure. And then, I think just to add to what Seth and Jeremy were already saying, one of the reasons I think it was not, of course, it was a lot of hard work to get nuclear into the global stocktake. But I think one of the reasons there wasn't as much resistance is because there actually isn't as much resistance to nuclear anymore. You really have just a handful of countries, and really mostly Germany, has been very influential in a sort of outsized way in previous COPs to what was agreed. And I think they're just being outvoted by everyone else that, either supports nuclear or really frankly has no problem with nuclear. So I think that shift is very important.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like Germany, in a way, and Germany, maybe Austria, have kind of gotten beaten back into their boxes on this, because it's difficult for them to argue. And I think especially for the developing world that, look, you should have, you should have these things. We enjoy, and it's also hard. And I think you begin to lack credibility when the system that you've tried to create over the last 20 years is not having the intended effect to the degree that you would hope for. So I've been peeking early at the Q&A. I've got a question, and it's a good question here, but you look at 24 nations signed the tripling of nuclear energy, but there were a few nations that didn't sign the agreement, notably Russia and China. What is a person to conclude from seeing that they were not signatories to that agreement?
I think I could start with that. I don't think they were invited. I don't know for certain, but I think that the United States had a leading role in organizing that group, and some other nations, and view Russia and China very much as rivals. It turned out that during COP, Putin came to the UAE, and he had an oil-related meeting in Abu Dhabi, and he made a comment there that he supported the goal that was being put forth at COP. He easily could have gone over to the COP site and signed it. If he was invited, he was there, and he said he supported it. So I think there's that. I also think that China and Russia, frankly, are in the lead right now of doing the most to deploy new nuclear. And to some extent, when you see France, South Korea, US, countries that view them competitively signing this statement, it was a little bit of a notion of, we have to get our act together to match what those countries are doing and then get ahead of them. From what I hear, there will be more countries signing, and maybe many more countries signing. So it wouldn't surprise me if maybe those countries do. But I think initially, this was more for countries that are looking to match and then get ahead of Russia and China in deployments. And I think the CEOs that were there signing contracts to say how we're going to do this, I think was a big part of that. And they want to see Russian and Chinese companies being the ones showing how they're going to do this.
Yeah. I'll give anybody else a shot here. I think that pretty clear explanation there. But all right, so without anything more on that, let me sort of now move to kind of our next topic here, which is the relevance and impact of COP after the meeting breaks up, after the stock, the stocks have been taken, and people go about their daily business, making business decisions, some of them pretty significant business decisions that impact the climate in the long term. How does COP have an impact going forward? Because nothing that's in there is necessarily binding, right? So it's kind of it's a narrative, it's a hat thrown over a fence, use whatever analogy that you want. But how does COP and that process remain relevant in between COPs? Elina, I'll jump to you first.
Sure, absolutely. So one thing that's certainly missing at the COP in general are discussions on kind of the hard implementation of these political commitments, which are very important, especially when it comes to nuclear. We know that for nuclear to become this reality of, 3x, 4x, whatever it is, we need government support, even for projects that are purely commercial. They just really can't proceed without that support. So I think the COB gives companies that are trying to fill in the gaps, as well as, advocacy organizations, trade associations, and others to go back to their governments and say, hey, you guys made this commitment, whether it was a hard commitment or a soft commitment. We have a project, or we're planning a project, or, we want to see the following 20 projects happen. These are the pieces that are missing. And these are the pieces that need to be filled in. And I'm this week in New York. The NEI had their nuclear financing summit, which was very well attended, had lots and lots of investors, there. And, there was a lot of enthusiasm in part coming out of the COP on this commitment, to triple nuclear capacity. But there was also a lot of discussions about, here are the missing pieces, right? We're still uncertain about the cost overruns and how do we get insurance for that. We still don't have enough equity available for these first of a kind projects. We still don't have enough hard offtake contracts. And we need government to step up. And yes, the US government's already provided lots of support, but there are still these missing pieces. They're not necessarily large dollar amounts, but they're more kind of the policy triggers that will unlock all of these projects that are being planned and make them real, and then make the United States look good in actually meeting its commitments that it signed on to at COP28.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, how same question to you. How does the process maintain its relevance and impact, between now and Baku, Azerbaijan, 10 months from now?
Yeah, it's a tool that can be used to align government policy as a whole. And I'll give you a non-nuclear example right out the gate. Like Seth mentioned, the ultimate language conclusion that led to a transition away from fossil fuels. The Biden administration is now using that in part as part of their justification for the LNG export pause that they made this week. And frankly, the environmental community are holding their feet to the fire, right? FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, issued a approval of an export facility a couple of weeks ago, and immediately the environmental community was like, well, how can you sign in COP this agreement that says you're going to be transitioning away from fossil fuels and then approving these type of things, right? And so I think that's one mechanism of how it can influence policymaker action. In the case of nuclear, I think it's important because I think it's a gut check to say, okay, what else can we do to make this come to fruition? I'll give an example of a different multilateral agreement and how it changed policy here in the US recently on the nuclear side. In Japan, in April at the G7, there was a component of the joint communique there that talked about phasing out of Russian nuclear fuel products, right? After the US and the Japanese, the British, the French, and others came to that agreement, momentum on the Hill and within this administration increased on legislation that was going to implement an import restriction on Russian fuel products. And so, at one point there was a lot of hand-wringing of what would be the geopolitical dynamics there, things along those lines. But now that the US has signed and publicly said this is the statement with our allies, how are you going to make good on that on public policy? I think that's going to be important here moving in the next couple of months, particularly related to the nuclear 3X item. How do we invest more in the domestic nuclear supply chain? And I think Congress is going to act on that here in the next couple of months, hopefully the next month. How can we further modernize the NRC to allow them to review 20 new licenses to operate rather than 1 or 2 in a given year? And I think it's really helpful with folks like XM and DFC and even state who are out there trying to support the exports of these technologies. It really gives them wind to their backs as they're trying to market and use the key tools we have here in the US to not only accelerate domestic deployments here, but the deployment of US technologies abroad. And so, it can be a bit of a rallying cry, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, something you mentioned about the sort of the natural gas exports. I mean, one of the things that struck me, and Seth, I think you could probably talk about this a little bit, is, you look at the UAE, one of the largest producers of fossil fuels in the world, and they are taking the money that they've earned from selling fossil fuels and investing in clean energy technologies. I mean, there is sort of, you can argue there is a path here where, if you buy into the fact that rich nations have an obligation to help their developing countries, that one way of potentially meeting that commitment is to develop and improve their domestic clean energy capacity, so that at least in the near term, you can, maybe we are making more natural gas exports, but those exports are offsetting, carbon emissions from coal plants that are much higher, and that sort of gets us, down the sort of to the lower levels of carbon intensity globally. Seth, talk a little bit about the geopolitics of this coming out of here.
The president of the UAE, when he was the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, talked about eventually seeing the last oil tanker leaving from the UAE with the last barrel of oil that the country will ever export, either because the country has run out of oil to sell or the world no longer wants it. And the country is using those exports to bring in revenue to diversify the economy. And one way to do that is the nuclear power sector, as their fourth large reactor will open in the next couple of months. The plants there at Baraka in Abu Dhabi will produce about 25% of the world's electricity from that one fairly small site. And that's a lot of oil freed up that they used to burn as crude to generate electricity that they're selling instead, and diversifying their economy, and also going into other high-tech sectors and clean energy sectors. And with the UAE presidency of this COP, one of the things that happened with this support for nuclear coming out of it, and with ENEC, the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation, very much being involved with World Nuclear Association on driving the tripling of nuclear goal and other nuclear achievements at this COP, is that it really led to the question of, well, how do we achieve those goals? And it got to some very substantive discussions, and I think some substantive things that will come out of the COP. So including nuclear specifically in that final statement as a means to meet climate goals will help with the loss and damages fund that was set up at this COP to help pay countries deal with damage from climate change, to include nuclear power to help prevent further damage and losses. And I think that this inclusion of nuclear in this official UN document agreed to by 193 countries, 198 parties, helps set the stage for other international organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, to really start funding nuclear projects that didn't, because it's the same member states. And this is what the member states want. And when you look at who signed the tripling of nuclear goal, this included Ghana. This included countries around the world that really open eyes to potential export markets. The customers want this, and that helps policymakers. And in nuclear, there really is a government lead. The government's coming together and doing these things. The governments around the world saying they want nuclear power in their countries to be part of tripling it in the world. That really helps align U.S. policies and the U.S. private sector to supply it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So another question from the chat. This could be a stumper. I don't know, but who from the U.S. signed the tripling the tripling agreement? Was that the president? Was that the Secretary of Energy? Was it the climate envoy? What did those, who was signing that document?
Yeah, it was John Kerry, the climate envoy.
Okay.
President Biden had plans to be there. His his plans changed, partly because he had made a previously unscheduled trip to the Middle East, Israel, soon before that. And it wasn't coming back to the Middle East so quickly, but it was John Kerry who signed it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that's important too, as folks may know, Kerry is transitioning away from that role, and just this week they announced that John Podesta will be in that spot, and he's going to serve in this domestic and international kind of hybrid role. And I think that gives me confidence in this administration's wanting to follow through on this, as well as we'll now have the person who is in that role who needs to follow through on Kerry's commitment there as the person who's coordinating both domestic and international policy decisions.
Yeah. So next year, the COP29 is in Baku, Azerbaijan. I don't remember the exact dates, but again, here, another significant oil producing country. Is that going to influence the tenor of the conversations? Let's maybe fast forward to what things look like next year. Are there new issues on the table? What's the COP29 preview?
So maybe I can start with that. Baku is a compromise. So originally this was supposed to COP29 was supposed to happen in Bonn, Germany, which certainly for the nuclear industry probably wouldn't have been the best thing. So Azerbaijan is a bit of a neutral territory. It's a country that has, strong relationships with the West. It has strong relationships with Russia and China, with the Middle East. So it's a little bit of a neutral ground. I think, somewhat apolitical. And it also has, I would say, the facilities to host the COP. Is a country with modern convention centers and is kind of central enough for people to fly into as well. So I think that was part of the compromise. It'll be interesting to see what the Azeri government does. They're certainly, like you said, a big oil and gas producer. They are also surrounded by countries that are developing nuclear power. So their neighbor and very close ally, Turkey, is one of the newcomer countries with the Kuyu plant. That's, about the first reactor is about 60% complete. Of course, they've got, Russia. That is a big nuclear power, a number of the countries, in the Middle East. North Africa, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, one of the biggest uranium producing nations, and is also looking at power. So it'll be interesting to see if actually there is, some consideration for a nuclear, even for Azerbaijan, that I've never really seen on the table as a serious, players potentially considering the nuclear energy option. So it'll be interesting to see. I think, a lot is going to be focused on this transition away from fossil fuels. But I think for nuclear, it's a better location than Germany would have been.
Right. Jeremy?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an intermediary COP too. So as I alluded to a little bit earlier, 2 years from now in Brazil is a really critical moment where countries are gonna have to come in and change their NDCs. It's kind of the checkpoint, the official checkpoint within the UN Conference of Parties and the climate framework. And so I think it's incumbent on us to keep the momentum on nuclear on this front. I think it was a huge success in making COP28 the nuclear COP, and we've got to keep that push and drive forward. I think Elina's right on some of the fossil fuel dynamics there. Yeah, but I think it's going to be that kind of intermediary COP, and we need to lean our shoulder in and continue to show progress so that nuclear continues to play an instrumental role in what will be a very important COP in 2 years in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Seth?
It will be a much smaller COP. It's physically a much smaller place to hold it. There won't be nearly as many hotel rooms. It will be a little more of a competition of who can get there other than the official delegates of the countries. There just won't be all of these blue and green zone passes that were available at Dubai. I suspect, given the tremendous success of nuclear at this COP, that other approaches like hydro will try to get their act together more and try to influence things there. And I think it's important that the nuclear supporting agencies keep it up and come up with, well, we met the goals. of what we wanted to get into the official COP documents and side agreements at COP, and what's next. What can we do, and come to some commonality of what we're pushing, having maybe exceeded what we thought we could do at COP28, to really push it further on how to have nuclear maybe specifically mentioned within financing mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in this, I think it's related to the COP discussion, but it sort of brings us back a little bit more to where we are in the U.S. right now, because obviously, the last few months, first of all, I have this theory that the favorability, if you look at the Henry Hub price for natural gas, that tells you basically the popularity index of nuclear among the C-suite of major investors in the U.S., right? When it's down by 3, down to 3 cents, that the interest tends to ebb a little bit, and then something happens and it goes back up. But we're definitely down off of those post-Ukraine highs, and we can see it, right? We've seen the cancellation of the carbon-free power project, right? We've seen what I would say is sort of a recalculation of the upward trajectory of nuclear that might stretch out a little bit longer in terms of building a resurgence. How important is it for the U.S. writ large, the nuclear enterprise, to keep their foot on the gas in continuing to develop advanced technologies, to do the policy things that enable more competitive exports of U.S. technology? How important is it for us to continue to make progress domestically, in that international conversation?
Yeah, I can start that one. So I think regardless of what administration we have, as of November this year, we're not going to see a resurgence of the old, right? The energy transition will happen one way or another. We have the electrification of so many sectors, right? I think, whether it's going to be more electric vehicles or whether one day we'll see a lot more hydrogen cars, right? I don't think we'll be going back to the old ways, regardless of, what administration is in the US or really, any other country. It may be more emphasis on certain things than others, right? Let's say unlocking more carbon capture in storage, or less. But, we're still heading towards a climate disaster, as I think people can actually personally see, right? I live in Alexandria, Virginia, and Old Town Alexandria is starting to look like Venice every time it rains, right? The systems just cannot handle this type of fluctuation that we're having, with snow one day and rain, and then it's summer the next. And that's starting to cost taxpayers. Cities are having to invest in adaptation. And I think the climate change adaptation numbers, the financials, have been underestimated, and we can see those numbers are rising. So I think people are starting to feel it, right? And in Europe, companies are feeling it where, they're not getting access to electricity, or it's just too expensive. So all of that, I think, is moving forward. And that's, one of the reasons that we really need to not just keep our foot on the accelerator, but push harder on nuclear, because we know that there are still many obstacles. We have made so much progress, but you mentioned with CFPP, is a tough thing to put together, because first of a kind project, first of a kind utility, lots of things that had to be done first. And, a lot of these firsts, maybe not all of them will pan out, right? That happens with any industry. That is not unique to nuclear. But we need to have many of these things so that quite a few of them can be successful, and we can have a fleet. And we need to get it done very soon, because things, climate change is not waiting. We're at 1.48 already. And if you remember the IPCC report back in 2018, that was an emergency cry of, oh my God, we're going to get to 1.5 by, early 2030s. Well, it's, we're here, right? And it's 2024. So I think we need to keep pushing forward, and we need to keep pushing forward harder. And the excuse for not deploying more nuclear historically has been, well, it's not fast enough. It takes too slow. Well, if you never start, right, then
Right.
it's never going to happen. So, that's kind of my message.
Well, and Jeremy, I'll go to you next. Do we have to keep our foot on the gas? And I think how a sort of a related question, especially one that I know you'll be familiar with, is, especially on the right side of the political spectrum, are we seeing an evolution of thinking, beginning to, evolve from, maybe some of its more, hardcore denialist, historical statements where, what are your thoughts on those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to keep our foot on the gas. It's urgent urgent action is needed, and U.S. leadership is needed both for the environment, for climate goals, for our economic growth and American competitiveness, and frankly to adapt to what is a rapidly changing and increase in technological innovation, things like data centers, AI, things that are going to need immense electricity demand increases in the developing world, and so. Politically, yes, you're seeing a big shift there, and members wanting to balance and policymakers wanting to balance those things. How do we reduce emissions, increase electricity affordability, and increase American manufacturing competitiveness in particular? And on the nuclear side, I'm getting this question actually a lot. Like, how could the election change U.S. approach to nuclear in particular? And I think one piece I'll underscore is. The good news is nuclear has become a significant bipartisan issue here in this country. The reason we've seen big policy done in Congress in overwhelming votes. A nuclear fuel vote in the Senate last year, 96-3. Only Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey, and Bernie Sanders were the three no's. They are the fringe in the U.S. political system now, being anti-nuclear, and I think that is a positive thing. And if we work under the assumption that President Trump is the Republican nominee, and President Biden will remain the Democratic nominee. Both administrations have significant nuclear accomplishments. Under the Trump administration, DFC removed its nuclear prohibition on financing here in the U.S. The Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, multi-billion-dollar program to cost share multiple reactors, X-Energy and TerraPowers in particular, was launched. Significant modernization efforts were made at the NRC along those lines. And then this administration, has deployed significant capital with XM and DFC and projects in Eastern Europe. We've seen them carry the ball forward on nuclear fuel. And so this is an area where I think U.S. leadership is going to be pronounced regardless of what happens in the election, whether it's the White House or here in Congress. And I think that's important both for U.S. and global climate action.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. All right, Seth, you get the last word. Take us home.
Look, I think that Congress in a bipartisan way is supporting nuclear because their voters are. And the companies in their districts and their states want the manufacturing, the revenue, the exports. I think that nuclear made the progress it did at COP because the governments around the world also realize that we can only meet climate and energy security goals with significant growth of nuclear power. We're not talking about 10 or 20%. We're talking tripling it in the next 26 years in the world by 2050, and countries around the world asking for that. And we're seeing many announcements since COP coming out of the UK, out of France, about large numbers of new reactors they're going to build, coming out of Belarus, coming out around the world. We're seeing progress in the tender process in the Czech Republic that they want to build many new reactors in Poland, several African countries. And I think by the time we get to Baku, there will be more of these contracts signed, more announcements, and even more of a realization that without significant growth of nuclear, we're not going to meet the goals, and these countries are just talking to each other. So are you there to get this done or just talk to each other? And I think COP28 was a big step toward we're there to get it done.
Well, Elina Teplinsky, Seth Grae, Jeremy Harrell, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate it. Members, we will have a recording of this available tomorrow, and until then, have a good rest of the week, have a good weekend, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.